the category of scientific revolution gets in the way of understanding early modernity, not blocks our understanding, renders us blind, because it's associated with a number of other twins. So the scientific revolution comes along with a collection of other categories for it to work, for it to do its magical work of explaining modernity, quote unquote. So it comes along with the Renaissance, comes along with, as a category, it comes along with print culture or revolution in print, from manuscript to print, Einstein's the whole theory. It comes along with Republic of Letters. It comes along with public sphere. It comes along with Enlightenment, and it comes along with parliamentary democracy, and the French Revolution, ultimately, modernity, and also the Industrial Revolution. All these come into a single package. They are kind of assembled in a way to explain something we call modernity. And if you take one of these elements of this set of categories that overlap in order to reinforce one another, because they reinforce one another, you are left with little. And so the Spanish monarchy and America, Spanish America in particular, are kind of the opposite side of the coin of this set of overlapping categories: scientific revolution, public sphere, print culture, blah 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 blah. Ultimately, democracy, and the end of the ancien regime, modernity. The Spanish monarchy and the Spanish America represent the opposite. Represents dystopia, represents anti-modernity, represents violence, represents absolutism, represents tyranny, represents lack of knowledge, ignorance, etc. So everything that is the antithesis of modernity is kind of compiled there in all these tropes we have associated with the Black legend that are still very much alive in the narratives we have of colonial Latin America to this day. So what I want to do, or I've been trying to do, is to upset these, the very category of modernity. That is really, we have to get rid of that category because it is associated with this set of overlapping concepts. If you take one of them, you don't have modernity, or you have some kind of deformity, you have some teratological monstrosity, namely Spanish America, or the New World, or the Spanish monarchy in the New World, particularly. So I want to present an example of how distorting the category of scientific revolution and modernity can be to understand what transpired in the 16th century and in the 17th century, but particularly in the 16th century. So we have this notion that skepticism emerged somewhere in Europe with the Renaissance, out of the reading of the classics through Renaissance philology kind of created, shed light on the contradictions of ancient texts and the medieval texts and so on and so forth. So it generated not only a love of the revival Renaissance of Pyrrhonism or skepticism, etc., as classical knowledge, but also generated skepticism itself, What is the nature of the truth? And so if you don't have Renaissance philology, if you don't have the Renaissance, you don't have a skepticism. And skepticism leads to everything else. And it's connected to everything else. The print culture, Renaissance skepticism leads to ultimately the new science. Descartes, Bacon answers to skepticism. Now, what if skepticism was central to 16th century not devotional practice, but theologies and missionary work in the Americas? What if skepticism is born of this probabilism that was necessary to create a church in the New World in the 16th century? I begin with two ideas that I already expressed here, and one is the idea that the law comes from the bottom up in the New World, and particularly in the 16th century. Cédulas, mandamientos, ordenanzas, etc., come from the bottom up through petitioning. But what if the laws of the church and the practice of the church also come from the bottom up through petitioning? What if synods and councils are spaces when not only bishops and members of religious orders, but also the laity can participate through petitioning in the creation of regulations about the everyday life of the church? So if you look at the everyday life workings of the church in the 16th century, you find that concilios and synods come in the same way as cédulas, mandamientos, ordenanzas come to life through an act of debate, dialogue, and petitioning from the bottom up. It's not just the bishop that decides this is the way it's going to be done, but individuals have a way of participating through petitioning in the creation of new rules about sacraments, new rules about all the sacraments of the church, baptism, marriage, etc., etc. In the New World, we know that whatever rules came from Europe when it comes to the implementation of sacraments did not apply, did not work out, because there was a great diversity in the implementation of all these rules. The Franciscans had a particular understanding of baptism, so too did the Dominicans, the Augustinians as well, which led to a great diversity in the implementation of these sacraments. So here I have an image of Alonso de la Veracruz produced in Mexico. It's about the sacrament of marriage, and sacrament of marriage understood from the perspective of missionary work in the Indies. And so Veracruz becomes an individual who has to square the circle. The practice of the Augustinians when it comes to marriage among the Purépechas differs from the practice of Augustinians among the Nahua in central Mexico when it comes to marriage. And so to the in the East Indies when it comes to Asians and the role of polygamy, and whether you can actually implement conversion in these different settings in which marriage has a different rooting in society and ways of understanding contract and reproduction of society, etc., etc. So here you have a text that is profoundly probabilistic in its understanding of marriage, the sacrament of marriage. What is the proper, how to perform the proper ritual of marriage, in different settings. That is the question of Veracruz. So what we ascribe as probabilism of the Jesuits in the 17th century or late 16th century as a category, as an epistemological category of dealing with authority and dealing with contrasting authorities in particular settings in which you don't have access to everything you know and need in order to deal with the penitent, in the New World already begins in the 16th century with these debates on the appropriate way of handling sacraments, but either be baptism or penitence or marriage or the Eucharist, etc., etc. It's central to the debates of these religious orders already in the 16th century. So what I'm suggesting is that the rise of skepticism in early modernity comes in different ways in the context of empire, in the context of expansion, conversion, and missionizing, and it's not related to Renaissance philology. It comes from a different venue and a different a different trajectory. That if you take Renaissance philology as the only way, you get this becomes mysterious and becomes completely obscured and ignored. So to thus the issue of, so here you have Veracruz's study of the sacrament of marriage that goes all the way to Milan in 1599. So it's incorporated as a text in Italy, even though it originated in Mexico in 1557. Okay, it disappeared now. The other element that is central to the understanding of why there is this probabilistic understanding of moral truth and moral theology, and therefore the rise of a skeptical perspective, epistemological skepticism in the New World, is the very creation of the church in the New World, which it comes from different ways in which different religious orders constituted themselves vis-a-vis papal, the papacy, that gave them certain special prerogatives. So in the 16th century, we have these this multiplicity of origins that are reflected in the effort of each one of these orders to compile the religious, the papal briefs that originated, that gave them authority in different settings in the New World. So here you have Augustinians that printed in 1556 as they are fighting with bishops, Tridentine or pre-Tridentine bishops, their authority in parishes. They have to remind them of the special privileges given by the papacy to them, and they leads to this type of publications. Then you have the Franciscans who are also fighting for their life against bishops in 1568 that lead to the printing of the special briefs given by the papacy, and so on and so forth. The way in which the church originates out of dealings with different levels of authority is reflected also in the way in which the councils and synods originated. So again, the third councils all over the Indies, Council of Peru and Third Council of Mexico, has this element of participation from the bottom up that is being completely ignored by the historiography, as if the church created everything from the top down, from Rome down, as if all these ideas of moral theology and the practices of the sacraments and differences in the way the sacraments were implemented in the New World and in different regions somehow came out of decisions in Madrid or in Rome, when in fact came from local practices everywhere else. That led in turn to this probabilistic, skeptical perspective that I refer to. So to make the long story short, because I'm running out of time and everybody's running out of patience, I want to suggest that this narrative of scientific revolution that associates skepticism to Renaissance philology needs to change. It needs to change because it's not true, or it's partially true, and it blocks out of our perspective realities and practices that have no connection to these European narratives and these European teleologies, and so we need to rewrite the history of probabilism and the history of skepticism if you really take into account the practices in the New World in the 16th century and how the church operated from the bottom up, not from the top down. I think I'm done with that, and I don't know how to go back to how to get out of share screen. I don't know how to do it. So you still have my screen or not?
Yeah, but you can click on you have the exit there. Yeah, exactly, that one.
So
that's great.
It's done?
It's done, yes.
Okay. Hold on. I need to do something quickly. Hold on.
Okay. Well, in the meanwhile, we can talk a little bit about the purpose of the workshop and how we approach it. Our pretension my pretension when I called for this workshop, when I invited the participants, was to discuss some elements regarding the scientific revolution, especially when these elements are considered in the light of the scientific revolution, in the light of the global history of science and the colonial science in Latin America specifically. What we have seen here, by considering historical cases, is that the traditional historiography of the scientific revolution invisibilizes different narratives that, when put in the context of this traditional historiography or this traditional conception of this analytical category, are difficult to explain. By focusing on these historical cases, I think that we can shed light on the different realities that emerged in the same period that are not necessarily connected to the scientific revolution, but that are in the end important, or represent in the end important transformations in the history of knowledge. And I think that that is one of the goals of the workshop, and I think we did it correctly. Now that Professor Jorge is back, I would like to open the section of questions with a question regarding this bottom-up consideration of the way in which laws were produced, and even moral laws or theologically related laws in Latin American societies, which were highly hierarchical, with a system of castes that were established, like in Mexico, for instance, or not so well established as in New Granada. How these differences between races, between calidades, as they call them, address the question of the bottom-up construction of the laws. I mean, were differences in the treatment of different castas, of different calidades, of different races, or were they treated equally, and in the end the bottom-up system remained untouched?
Well, the problem of how the casta system originates is it wasn't a creation of Charles V in somewhere in Valladolid, or Philip II somewhere in El Escorial. It comes from conflicts among communities and within communities, and through petitioning. The creation of all the laws restricting mestizos in 1560s, 70s, well, from the 1550s on, after particularly the civil war in Peru, when they are seen as threatening by all parties. It comes from petitioning from indigenous communities mostly. I mean, all the laws regulating mestizos are laws that come from the bottom up by indigenous communities, or most of them. So there's that element. There are hierarchies indeed, but the fact that there are these restrictions to castas or to mestizos or whoever does not mean that first of all, that the laws are implemented everywhere. They remain shifting and changing, and it didn't mean that these castas or these individuals whose identities were created through this process of creating the law by petitioning did not have a chance of counter-petition or creating alternative laws, or through the resource of grace and Mercedes sidestep these restrictions. So it's not a problem of whether there were laws that were hierarchical. I mean, that is true of Europe and everywhere else, China as well, or the Ottomans or Safavid Empire. I mean, the hierarchy was universal. It is the problem of how do we explain the origin of those hierarchies. And I am suggesting that we need to shift our attention, not to decisions coming from Madrid, or it's a very passive state. At least in the 16th century, what we have is a very passive state that is simply responsive and cannot do much more, because I mean the bureaucracy is thin, and I mean, even if Philip II wanted to do X, Y, or Z, couldn't do it. So it's limited to responding to petitions from the bottom up, and trying to administer and manage those factions that are fighting with one another over control of local politics. So it's an issue of multiplication of factions that are denouncing each other, and a state that does not believe any of them. I'm talking about skepticism, that knows that this system of triangulation leads to exaggeration, rhetorical exaggeration, and is very skeptical of the position of everyone, or the accounts of everyone, as a product of exaggeration, a system that promoted exaggeration.
Thank you, Jorge. I don't know. Yes, Nidia. Nidia, you have to turn on your mic.
Sorry. Jorge, it's very interesting that you are engaging with an epistemological argument. that was at some point very important in the historiography of there being a scientific revolution, which is skepticism and probabilism. And so I wonder, this is really, I mean, this is a big question, but are you saying that there is a scientific revolution in a sense by still dealing with the category and shifting its place?
No, I am trying to get rid of the category of modernity, not only scientific revolution, the whole thing. Whether there was scientific revolution or modernity, I just don't care. The problem is that those categories render invisible everything else and everybody else, silence everything else and everybody else. So unless you are one of 3 tiny societies in the globe, either, I don't know, Northern Italy, talking about Galileana, or Germany, or France, or the Netherlands, or England, there's no room for anything else, and in the genesis of anything else, when it comes to modernity, there's no room for anyone else. Somehow empire fits in, but the radicalism of phenomena, of social phenomena, with I don't know, it's Safavid Empire, the Ottomans, the Qing, the Ming, it literally disappears until the Europeans come and begin to interact with the locals, and modernity arises somehow out of these interactions with these local societies. I mean, my problem is with the category of modernity, with a set of categories that render invisible all sorts of things of societies that are not Northern European.
So when you say we need to rewrite the histories of skepticism, it's not because you want to continue placing skepticism at an important point in the history of intellectual history. It's just by getting inside the category and perhaps finding it somewhere else, you will undo the periodization completely. Okay.
Yeah, I don't want to say, oh, skepticism began in Mexico in the 16th century, not in whatever. No, there were forms of skepticism and probabilism in Mexico in the 16th century. And probably there were forms of skepticism and probabilism among the Ottomans in the 14th or 15th century. And there was probably radical democratic movement somewhere in the Ming China that might have been successful or not, but emerged without parliamentary democracy, but and so on and so forth.
This doesn't mean that modernity is wider, bigger, more comprehensive. No. Okay, good. Okay, I get it now.
No, I don't have modernity envy. It is, or alternative modernity is some kind of, I don't know, illness. No, it's simply that the categories are insufficient. The categories are prisons. I mean, really bound us to certain narratives, and we cannot escape.
Sergio.
Jorge, well, thanks very much. It's very provocative, this idea of how you're reading the movement of knowledge, information, and in the church. I'm curious about, in this way, you are connecting, especially from bottom up, which role or which roles you assign to Inquisition, for example, in this context. Were you located stopping flux of
Inquisition
is knowledge, preventing, or how you put them in this narrative?
Well, this is something those who are lovers of democracy and parliamentary democracy have to deal with. The Inquisition, it was a instrument of democratic participation from its very origins. a way for the populace to put down those who had power, local power. So you see that in the New World. The Inquisition from the very beginning acts as a way for individuals to enact retribution against lords. In the case of Carlos of Texcoco, who was burned by the Inquisition. I mean, it is women in his household who introduced who denounce him, and there are commoners in towns that over which he had rule over that denounce him for idolatry as well. So he's denounced by women for sexual assault, and he's denounced by commoners for idolatry, for keeping idols in caves. And so if you look at the documentation on the idolatries in Peru, there's a term, I mean, well, the campaign against idolatries in Peru from 1580s to 1640s, and you look at the documentation of they are all driven by local commoners and local rivals that denounce each other, and it's out of these denunciations that you have proceedings. So yeah, the Inquisition, it's the most democratic of institutions. Go deal with that.
Jorge, do you think that maybe a comparison study, something like that, or something like that, can provide more evidence to demonstrate that this category, the modernity, is not precise to describe the series of transformations that were taking place in the 16th century, in the sense that it can provide evidence to show that there were transformations happening around the globe and not only in Europe? Do you think that this kind of discussions can be nurtured by comparative studies with other geographical contexts?
The early modern came to replace the Renaissance as a category, but I can replace the Renaissance category for precisely because there was this realization that there were changes that were global, not only located in Europe. And so the category of early modernity is associated with the study of other empires. So there's early modernity with the Ottomans, there's early modernity with the Safavid, the Mughal, there's early modernity with the Ming, etc. And at least that is the way the Journal of Early Modern History was set up from the very beginning, global, in which I played a role in the editorial board for years, because there was this element of this comparative element that allow many scholars to see processes in globalization that resemble each other, and could be studied under the same umbrella. So the Journal of Early Modern History from the very beginning did Ottoman, Safavid, Mughal, Ming, Japan, etc. Not only Europe, not only Renaissance. Yet, I've grown disgruntled with that very category of early modernity for the reasons that I describe here, because by buying into the concept of modernity or early modernity, you're buying into you have to find among the Ottomans of the Mughal or the Safavid the inklings of that modernity: print culture, public sphere, parliamentary democracy, whatever. The things that I just skepticism, critique of authority, blah 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 blah. or else you don't have early modernity or early modern science. So I think it's teleological. It's a way of narrating that forces us into focusing on these, posing questions that fit into those overlapping categories. If you don't have, the questions of the historiography come from those overlapping categories. Either you are in Mongolia or in Germany. And that is the problem.
Yes. Thank you very much, Jorge. If there are no further questions, I would say that it is fair to finish now. We spent more time than we planned. And well, again, thank you very much to all the participants for your time and for preparing these fascinating presentations and papers, and to the attendees for accepting the invitation to participate in the workshop. Have a good day, have a good night, and see you.
See you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you. Bye-bye.
See you all.
Bye-bye.
Good to see you. Bye.
See you.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.